was on a damp and dreary evening in November that I first encountered the curious affair which had come to be known among the more discreet circles of London as the case of the painted hand. The fog had rolled down from the Thames in such a manner that the gas lamps along Baker Street flickered like wary sentinels, and the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for some unseen hand to move within its shadowed streets. I had just returned from a late consultation with a patient whose ailments were of a decidedly prosaic nature, and my mind, wearied by mundane infirmities, sought the particular excitement which only the company of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes could provide. Holmes was, as usual, ensconced in his chair beside the fire, a long pipe clenched between his teeth and a half-finished chemical experiment bubbling upon the table before him. He glanced up from the curious arrangement of coloured liquids and crystal tubes with a sudden intensity that reminded me, yet again, of the peculiar brilliance he could summon at will. "Ah, Watson," he said, his voice drawing a whisper of satisfaction from the hearth. "You have returned just in time. Observe this." He gestured with a dramatic flourish at a small vial of deep vermilion liquid. A remarkable observation. A mere drop of this solution, when introduced to the ordinary starch of a paper, reveals its presence after a fortnight, invisible to the casual eye. Quite ingenious, would you not say? I raised my eyebrows and smiled, accustomed as I was to these displays of his restless intellect. I confess, Holmes, that the practical applications of invisible stains have eluded me, unless one counts the art of mischief in a schoolroom. Holmes waved my objection aside. "Nonsense, Watson. Genius is never to be measured by trivialities. The mind that can perceive what others cannot, and the hand that can execute with precision, these are tools far more powerful than any common knowledge of ailments or mundane maladies. But tell me, how fares your patient this evening?" I gave a succinct report of my late visit, all the while noting the way Holmes' eyes, sharp as a hawk's, seemed to glance past my words, as though his attention were already elsewhere, peering into some unseen realm of deduction. And indeed, my suspicions were confirmed scarcely moments later, when a rap upon the door announced the arrival of a visitor, whose very presence seemed to carry the weight of desperation. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a woman of no great age, perhaps in her late 20s, but with a visage pale and tense, as if life itself had pressed upon her chest with unyielding force. She wore a cloak of dark green, damp with the city's ever-present mist, and her hands trembled as she held a small leather purse close to her bosom. "Miss," I began, but Holmes interposed a sharp glance. "Miss Eleanor Blythe," the woman said, with a voice trembling but dignified. I was told that Mr. Holmes could assist me." She faltered, as if the very act of speaking carried danger. Holmes rose with a peculiar grace, the height of his intellect always mirrored in the precision of his movements. "Madame," he said, "you are indeed in the proper place. Pray, take a seat, and if you will be so kind as to describe the nature of your concern, I shall endeavour to offer my assistance." She hesitated, glancing about the room, her eyes betraying a mixture of fear and determination. It is my father," she said at last. He has been found, well, not quite as one would expect. Scotland Yard, I am afraid, is at a loss. They have suggested I seek your counsel." Holmes, his brow furrowed, motioned for her to continue. "Pray, Miss Blythe, do not be alarmed. Speak plainly. Every detail, no matter how trivial it may seem, can prove significant." The woman swallowed hard and produced from her cloak a small leather-bound notebook. From it she removed a single sheet of paper, folded and slightly creased. On the page, rendered with meticulous care in what appeared to be crimson paint, was the outline of a human hand. The fingers were elongated, unnaturally so, and each digit bore an odd, almost hieroglyphic mark. "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was found beside my father. The police inspector Lestrade himself calls it a curious prank, but I fear it is something far more sinister. My father, a respected antiquarian, devoted his life to rare manuscripts and obscure artifacts. Yet in his study this hand appeared, painted in his own ink, and now he is gone." Holmes leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed upon the document. He did not speak immediately, choosing instead to examine the painting with meticulous attention, his long fingers tracing the faint brush strokes. "Curious," he murmured at last. "Very curious indeed. Note, Watson, the paint is of an unusual composition. Vermilion, perhaps, though mixed with a binder not common to ordinary inks. And these marks. He tilted his head, as if listening to the faint whisper of some invisible logic. They are not merely decorative. There is a method here, a deliberate communication of sorts. Your father, you say, was an antiquarian? Yes, she replied, a tear trembling upon her cheek. He dealt in rare manuscripts, mostly Eastern texts, and often came home with objects of peculiar nature. He was cautious, but not secretive. Holmes nodded slowly, the cogs of his mind turning with silent ferocity. And the night before his disappearance, was anyone at all known to visit him? Miss Blythe shook her head. No, not that I know of. Only he and his assistant, Mr. Faraday. But he claims to have left at dusk, and my father's study was locked when I arrived the next morning. I glanced at Holmes, sensing already the storm of deduction gathering within him. It seems, Holmes, I ventured cautiously, that we have our work cut out for us. A mysterious hand, strange markings, and a vanished scholar. Scotland Yard is perplexed, yet I suspect the solution may lie not in the obvious, but in the minutiae of these details. Holmes' eyes sparkled with that cold fire I had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. Exactly, Watson, and we shall begin at once. There are streets to navigate, rooms to scrutinize, and the faintest traces to follow. Every shadow in London tonight may hold a clue. But mark my words, the painted hand is only the beginning. There are layers beneath layers in this affair, and only by attending to the minutest anomalies shall we unearth the truth. As Miss Blythe departed, leaving her sorrow and urgency behind her, I could not help but feel the familiar thrill of anticipation stir within me. The fog pressed heavier upon the streets outside, yet in our rooms the fire crackled with the promise of intellect and mystery. Holmes, as ever, was already several steps ahead, his mind a blade cutting through the obfuscation of fear and conjecture, poised to reveal truths hidden from the ordinary observer. Little did I know that night would mark the beginning of a sequence of events more perplexing and perilous than any I had yet chronicled. The painted hand, with its crimson ink and cryptic symbols, was but a herald of shadows that stretched across London, and I, loyal companion and chronicler, would follow wherever Holmes' extraordinary genius might lead. And so, as the fog swallowed the gas lamps along Baker Street, I set pen to paper, ready to record the unfolding of a mystery that would test the limits of deduction, courage, and human perception, the likes of which London had never seen. The morning following Miss Blythe's visit was grey and insistent in its chill. A fine drizzle clung to the windows of Baker Street, turning the gas lamps into blurred halos of light. I awoke to the sound of Holmes already moving about the sitting room, his slippered feet barely making a sound upon the worn carpet, yet each motion deliberate, as though the entire room itself were a chessboard and he a master plotting several moves ahead. "Good morning, Watson," he said without pause, his eyes narrowed in that familiar, inscrutable fashion. "We must proceed to 14 Camden Row at once. Your task, as always, is to observe, and I caution you look for that which is not immediately apparent." I dressed with haste, knowing that Holmes' morning decisions were not to be questioned, and soon we were hailing a hansom cab, the carriage's wheels splashing through the slick streets. As we crossed the Thames and wound our way into the more sombre quarters of the city, I noticed the subtle play of Holmes' mind at work. He gestured, almost imperceptibly, to a signpost partially obscured by mist. "Notice, Watson," he whispered, "how the paint upon that sign shows wear in an unusual fashion. Suggests traffic both by foot and wheel, but the right-hand corner bears evidence of repeated pressure. Likely a habitual leaning place for some frequent passer. Trivial, you say? Perhaps. But these details form the lattice upon which deduction is constructed." I inclined my head, silently cataloguing the observation, while the cab lurched forward along a narrow lane where the fog pressed down like a damp curtain. Soon we arrived at a modest brick residence, its windows darkened, and its doorway framed by creeping ivy. The number above the door, 14, was barely visible beneath the drizzle, and Holmes' keen eyes noted every imperfection. The chipped edges of the wooden door frame, the slight discoloration where the lock had been replaced, the faintest trace of footprints upon the threshold. Inside, the house retained the stillness of a sealed tomb. A single maid appeared from the back rooms, her hands clasped nervously before her, and she led us to the study where Miss Blythe's father had been last seen. It was a room of moderate size, lined with shelves that carried the weight of countless leather-bound volumes, many of them bearing foreign scripts whose significance I could only guess at. A Persian rug, patterned in deep crimson and indigo, was pressed unevenly beneath the central desk, and the morning light fell in a pale beam upon the polished surface, highlighting faint smudges as though some invisible hand had traced patterns of warning. Holmes moved with precise caution, his eyes darting, not like those of a man searching for the obvious, but as one attuned to the faintest anomalies in the environment. "Observe, Watson," he said, kneeling beside the desk. "The dust upon this surface is disturbed in a manner inconsistent with ordinary use. Note the pattern 3 arcs, forming what appears to be a semicircle. The owner of this hand, whoever left it, did not merely place the painted hand. No, there was movement, deliberate and concealed, a ritualistic approach designed to mislead." I bent closer, trying to see what he saw. Indeed, the dust bore traces of motion, subtle and almost imperceptible. I could not help but shiver, for it was the first hint that this affair was no ordinary domestic curiosity, but something methodical, intentional, and, I feared, dangerous. Holmes rose and approached the shelves. He tapped a series of books lightly, producing small echoes that reverberated like whispers through the room. "The position of these tomes," he murmured, "is peculiar. A gap of several inches, yet no book has been removed. Someone wished to suggest removal, perhaps, to frighten or to confuse. And here," he plucked a small volume from the shelf, a manuscript of Middle Eastern origin. "Notice the faint smell of camphor. Someone attempted to mask the scent of another substance. Arsenical compounds, I suspect. Yet carefully, Watson, carefully applied. No casual poisoner would exercise such precision." I glanced toward him in astonishment, noting how his mind dissected every minute detail. Even as I catalogued his observations, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. London had placed a puzzle before us, and Holmes' mind was already at work, laying out the pieces with meticulous care. Holmes' attention then returned to the floor, where he knelt examining the rug. "Look here, Watson. There is a faint indentation beneath the Persian weave. Not deep, but enough to indicate a heavy object was lifted recently. Perhaps a safe, or a chest. And the stain, observe the color. Not the ordinary vermilion of the hand upon paper. This is darker, oxidized as though older, yet fresh in applied." While I noted these details, Holmes' eyes flitted toward the window. There, against the damp frame, were scratches almost invisible, yet deliberate in direction and depth. Signs of a forced entry, I ventured. "Too precise," Holmes replied. "Not mere burglary. Someone who understands mechanics and secrecy. And Watson, note the absence of fingerprints, even in the places one might expect. Whoever entered this room is methodical, careful, and intimately familiar with the ways in which evidence betrays the unwary. They are clever, yet leave a trail just sufficient to tease the mind of an observer, a psychological signature. Watson, whoever committed this act wished it to be discovered yet not understood." A low knock upon the inner door interrupted us. Miss Blythe's assistant, Mr. Faraday, appeared, a man of scholarly demeanor but visibly shaken. I heard you were here," he stammered, "and I thought it prudent to mention. Last night the study light remained on until quite late, and yet, when I entered early this morning, the painted hand was already on the desk." Holmes' gaze fixed upon him with a cold precision. "Ah, and you claim to have seen nothing else unusual?" Faraday hesitated. "Only, I thought I heard a slight movement behind the curtain, though the street was empty. I assumed it to be my imagination." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. And yet, Watson, this small detail may be more significant than any loud exclamation or obvious clue. The faintest of disturbances in London is often the herald of something considerable. We are not dealing with chance or mischief, but deliberate orchestration. Whoever painted the hand has a mind attuned to misdirection." I sat back, pen in hand, as the layers of the mystery began to unfold before us. Every observation seemed to peel away yet another veil, revealing complexity beneath complexity. Holmes, ever in his element, moved among the shelves, the desk, and the rug with a surgeon's precision, cataloguing not only physical traces but also the psychological undertones of the perpetrator's actions. As we left the house later that morning, the drizzle had intensified and the London fog hung low, obscuring the streets as though shielding some unseen watcher. Holmes, silent in the cab, seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant and yet sharply attentive to every movement outside the window. "Watson," he said at last, "this case will not be solved by ordinary means. There are multiple layers here, each intended to mislead, to test the observer. I suspect we shall encounter another incident before long, perhaps a disappearance, or worse, a second warning. The painted hand is but a prelude." I shivered, more from anticipation than cold. Already, I understood that this case would demand all our wits, patience, and courage. London, with its fog, its gaslight, and its secrets, had placed before us a puzzle unlike any I had yet chronicled, and Holmes, as ever, seemed 3 steps ahead, already dancing along the shadows of deduction, leaving me to follow and to record, faithful chronicler of his extraordinary mind. The days that followed our visit to Camden Row were marked by a peculiar tension. London itself seemed to tighten around us, the fog pressing into the very marrow of the streets and alleys, and the damp chill settling into one's bones. I found myself pacing the sitting room of 221B, pen poised above paper, attempting to catalogue the sequence of details that Holmes had already begun to unravel in his mind with merciless clarity. Yet, as ever, my attempts to anticipate his conclusions were laughably insufficient. Holmes, for his part, appeared lost in abstraction, seated cross-legged upon the sofa, his steepled fingers pressed to his lips, staring into the flickering fire as though some distant flame burned brighter than our hearth. It was on the 3rd evening, precisely as the fog pressed low across the Thames, that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard appeared at our door. His usual air of officious confidence was tempered by a strain of unease that I had not often seen upon his countenance. "Holmes," he said, giving me a perfunctory nod before addressing my friend, "I've brought a man who appears to be of immediate interest in the matter of the painted hand. I would have handled it myself, but, well, you understand." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I understand entirely, Lestrade. Pray, bring your suspect forward." The inspector hesitated a moment before ushering into the room a man whose appearance suggested both intellect and restraint. He was of medium height, neatly dressed, with a pallor that indicated either a delicate constitution or persistent anxiety. His eyes, dark and restless, darted between Holmes, Lestrade, and myself, never settling long upon any one figure. "Mr. Albert Crane," Lestrade said, "assistant to the late Mr. Blythe for many years. He discovered the painted hand alongside the body and has maintained that he knows nothing of it. However, circumstantial evidence points toward him. He was present in the house, and some oddities were reported in his behavior." Crane's voice when he spoke was quiet, almost tentative, yet carried an edge of defensiveness. "I swear, gentlemen, I had nothing to do with it. I found the hand, yes, and my master, he is gone. I do not understand what you suggest I could have done. I am loyal to his family and devoted to his work." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Crane's face. "We shall see, Mr. Crane. Tell me, do you know of any visitors to Mr. Blythe's study in the days preceding his disappearance? Anyone whom he might have trusted implicitly, or, conversely, anyone who bore him ill will?" Crane shook his head, though his fingers fidgeted nervously upon the arms of his chair. "No one, sir. He received letters, of course, as one does, but I cannot recall any recent visitor beyond myself. Mr. Blythe was often alone, except for scholarly colleagues or the occasional client wishing to examine rare manuscripts." Holmes' eyes gleamed with an almost predatory focus. "Indeed. And yet, Mr. Crane, it is your presence in the house at the time the painted hand was discovered that has drawn the attention of Scotland Yard. You were alone, were you not, in the study, before the body was found?" Crane's eyes widened, and a faint tremor ran through his jaw. I was in the adjoining room. I did not enter the study until I saw." His voice faltered, but he steadied himself, glancing toward Lestrade for reassurance. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured quietly, "the subtle signs of tension in the suspect, not the raw fear of innocence threatened, but the careful cultivation of truth and misdirection. A man who fears the implications of his knowledge yet seeks to appear blameless." I noted the distinction, though I could not yet pass its full significance. Holmes, however, appeared to read every micro-expression with ease, as though the subtlest flicker of eyelid or twitch of the mouth were letters forming a message only he could decipher. Holmes rose suddenly, his manner brisk. Mr. Crane, I should like you to accompany us tomorrow to Camden Row. There are further observations to be made, and I prefer to see how you react to the environment itself. Crane's face paled. I would not presume indispensable, Mr. Crane. You may either assist in clarifying these unfortunate circumstances or continue to obscure them. The choice, of course, is yours. Holmes' tone, though mild in words, carried the unmistakable edge of command. The following morning we returned to the Blythe residence. Holmes, with his customary meticulousness, examined every corner anew, noting shadows beneath shelves, smudges upon windowsills, and the faint trace of a substance I could not immediately identify upon the edge of the rug. Crane followed behind us, his steps hesitant, and I could see the continual struggle between his desire to appear composed and his unmistakable anxiety. Holmes motioned for him to approach the desk. Mr. Crane, I should like you to observe this and tell me precisely what you notice. Crane's eyes traced the surface of the desk, lingering upon the faint outlines of the painted hand, now preserved under a thin sheet of protective glass. It is the same hand I discovered, as I said. The lines are precise, yet I cannot read them. The paint is strange, I admit, but otherwise. Holmes held up a hand. Not precise enough, Mr. Crane. You did not note the discrepancy in the stroke of the fifth digit, nor the slight tilt of the hand upon the page, suggesting it was not placed haphazardly. And yet, your role in its discovery, and your proximity to the study that night, renders you a person of immediate interest. Crane's hands trembled slightly as he stepped back. I swear I did not. Holmes' eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed upon him. Indeed. But we must continue to explore the obvious before we venture into conjecture. Scotland Yard would find in you the most convenient suspect, Mr. Crane. Yet I, as always, distrust convenience. And there is one particular element I have yet to understand fully, a detail missed by others, yet glaring in its subtlety. He moved toward the window, pointing toward the faint scratches upon the frame. Observe, Watson, these marks. Not the work of a hurried intruder. A man familiar with locks could have entered here without trace. Yet these scratches suggest a tool applied with care, as if to simulate forced entry. The implication, therefore, is deliberate misdirection. And Mr. Crane, your presence, your meticulous report, your evident anxiety, these are consistent not with guilt but with knowledge withheld. Crane's mouth opened, then closed. I could see the conflict within him, fear, loyalty, and perhaps the burden of a secret too heavy for ordinary conscience. Holmes, as ever, did not press with accusation, allowing the psychological pressure to build naturally, drawing from the suspect a truth which might otherwise have been concealed. I suspect, Watson, he said quietly as we left Camden Row, that Mr. Crane knows more than he admits. Yet he is not the architect of this painted hand. No. The true hand behind this affair has a subtler intelligence, one that delights in misdirection and layered deception. Crane is but a piece, albeit an important one, upon a chessboard of far greater complexity. I noted his deduction, feeling the thrill of intellectual pursuit stir once more. Already, the case had introduced us to a labyrinth of evidence and suggestion, a web of subtlety and careful manipulation. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that the true villain, the author of the painted hand, was watching our progress from some shadowed corner of London, content to leave clues just sufficient to confound the unwary. As we returned to Baker Street, the fog thickened, curling about the gas lamps and filling the streets with a sense of oppressive mystery. Holmes remained silent, his mind clearly engaged in calculation far beyond the reach of ordinary reasoning. I, faithful chronicler, took my seat and began to commit to paper the details of our morning, aware that each observation, each nuance, might later prove pivotal in unraveling a puzzle that had already begun to defy comprehension. The first suspect had appeared, yet the true contours of the case remained obscured, a shadow beneath the shadow. I could only follow Holmes' lead, trusting that his extraordinary intellect would, in due course, reveal what London's fog and fear had thus far concealed. The morning following our renewed examination at Camden Row dawned with a pale, timid light that struggled through the persistent London fog. I had barely finished my breakfast when Holmes, seated in his familiar chair, turned to me with an intensity that made my pen hesitate mid-air. "Watson," he said abruptly, "we must revisit the scene. There are details that escaped my initial scrutiny and significant to all but a trained eye. yet decisive in unraveling the sequence of events. "It concerns Mr. Crane." I rose, sensing already the meticulous pursuit that would occupy our day. As we threaded our way through the dripping streets of Bloomsbury, Holmes remained silent, his gaze sweeping over the pavement and the facades of houses with that uncanny alertness which I had long come to associate with his mind at work. Every puddle, every crooked signpost, every faint smear upon a doorframe seemed to register in him as part of a larger pattern. Upon arrival at the Blythe residence, we were met by Mr. Crane himself, who had evidently been anticipating our visit. His face, though composed, betrayed an unmistakable tension. He greeted Holmes and me in subdued tones, and we ascended the narrow staircase to the study without ceremony. Holmes' eyes immediately scanned the room. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the position of the chair. It has been shifted slightly, its rear legs pressing deeper into the carpet than the front. Subtle, yet telling. Someone left in haste or, more cunningly, in a measured manner designed to suggest haste where none existed." Crane's hands trembled lightly as he stood beside the desk. "I do not understand, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I have nothing to hide. I arrived early as usual." Holmes interrupted, his eyes glinting. "Precisely, Mr. Crane. And yet when I examined this desk the previous day, I noted that the ink upon the blotter bore two distinct shades, a subtle variation, one dark, freshly applied, the other older, almost imperceptibly faded. Now explain to me, if you can, why such an inconsistency should appear in a room that you claim to have left undisturbed." Crane faltered. His lips parted, then closed again without reply. I could see the internal struggle, the desire to remain truthful tempered by fear of suspicion. Holmes, as if sensing my thoughts, continued in a tone both measured and inexorably precise. "The painted hand," he said, "was not merely a message, nor a whim of some idle hand. It was intended to communicate, and in its composition lie clues missed by the ordinary observer. The brush strokes, the tilt, the precise arrangement of the digits all suggest an individual trained to conceal intent within apparent randomness. Yet, within this apparent randomness lies a subtle inconsistency, a psychological footprint, if you will, that betrays the hand behind it." Crane's face paled further. "I swear, sir, I do not understand. I only discovered it." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Indeed, Mr. Crane. And yet, your account contains a minor, yet significant inconsistency. You claim to have left the study momentarily, returning to find the hand already present. However, Holmes bent to examine a faint indentation upon the rug. These impressions indicate that the hand, or rather its painted representation, was manipulated within your presence. The weight upon the rug suggests a person of your approximate stature stood here at the precise moment the painting was applied. Coincidence? Perhaps, but it deserves further scrutiny." Crane swallowed audibly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the desk. I do not recall moving." Holmes, rising, cut him off with the gentle authority that always commanded obedience. "Memory is a curious thing, Mr. Crane. Selective in nature, influenced by fear, loyalty, and self-preservation. The inconsistency, though slight, reveals the truth one dare not speak aloud. You observed more than you admit, though I do not yet accuse you of action, only knowledge. That distinction, Mr. Crane, is critical." I observed Crane closely. He averted his eyes, his shoulders tightening as though bracing against some invisible force. Yet there was an honesty in his demeanor, a reluctance to fabricate beyond necessity. Holmes, I realized, had already judged him as a reluctant participant rather than a culprit. Holmes then turned to the shelves, his long fingers tracing the spines of the books with deliberate care. "Observe the dust, Watson. There is a faint displacement upon the upper shelves, suggesting a reach by one of considerable height. Yet, curiously, the lower volumes remain untouched, save for a single manuscript positioned at an odd angle, a distraction intended to mislead a casual observer, yet not enough to escape the scrutiny of a trained mind." He extracted the manuscript and opened it carefully. The pages, yellowed with age, revealed a series of arcane symbols, punctuated by diagrams of hands, gestures and annotations in an unfamiliar script. "The late Mr. Blythe was an antiquarian, yes," Holmes murmured, "but he also delved into the esoteric secret codes, mystical gestures, and symbolic communication. These diagrams are clearly relevant. And notice, Watson, the orientation of the hand upon the page matches precisely the painted hand discovered at the desk. A duplication of posture, not content. There is deliberate mimicry here, intended to draw attention to form rather than message. I felt a chill at the precision of this observation. Whoever had painted the hand, I thought, understood both Blythe's habits and his studies intimately. It was no act of random mischief, nor the work of a casual criminal. Holmes, without raising his voice, began pacing the room. We are dealing, Watson, with an individual who understands psychology as well as mechanics. The painted hand is a signal, a warning, a puzzle, or perhaps a lure. The perpetrator is guiding us as a hunter guides prey, revealing just enough to tempt curiosity but concealing the true intent. I turned my attention to Crane, who had slumped slightly into the corner of the room, silent, yet visibly attentive to every word Holmes spoke. "Do you think he is guilty, Holmes?" I asked quietly. Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he picked up the faintly stained blotter and held it to the light. Guilt, Watson, is often a simple matter of physical action. Knowledge, however, is far more complicated. Mr. Crane possesses knowledge, yes, but guilt, not yet. The true culprit has orchestrated these events to place suspicion precisely where it should not be. Observe the cleverness, Watson. Observe the patience. Observe the meticulous. Crane, finally speaking, broke the silence. "Sir, I do not know what more to tell you. I was present, yes, and I observed. I may have glimpsed a shadow behind the curtain. That is all. I am devoted to the Blythe family, I swear it." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "And that may very well be the truth, Mr. Crane. Your anxiety is genuine, and your caution commendable. Yet you are a witness to events, not the orchestrator. The inconsistencies I noted, the variations in ink, the pressure upon the rug, the arrangement of books point to someone far more cunning, and far removed from your position as assistant." I felt a weight lift slightly, both for Crane and for the narrative of the case. Yet even as Holmes spoke, I could not shake the sense that each revelation only drew us deeper into a maze of shadows. The painted hand was not an end, but a beginning, a key to a labyrinth whose walls were invisible yet suffocating. As we departed the Blythe residence, the fog lay thick over the streets, muffling the distant clatter of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a vendor. Holmes was unusually pensive, his eyes darting over the mist as if seeking a figure unseen by ordinary eyes. "Watson," he said at length, "the first suspect has been considered, inconsistencies observed, and yet the puzzle remains incomplete. The true hand behind this affair has yet to move decisively, but when it does, we must be ready. And ready, Watson, we shall be." I noted his words, my mind already racing to anticipate the next turn in this intricate and perilous affair. London, in its grey and dripping majesty, had become a stage upon which intellect and subtlety played the most decisive roles. And in this theatre of shadows, Holmes moved with the assured confidence of a man who sees both the visible and invisible threads of causality. Thus ended our day, with the first suspect examined, inconsistencies catalogued, and the shadow of a far more elaborate deception looming over us, like some predatory presence observing from the fog. I returned to Baker Street, pen in hand, knowing that this case, more than any I had yet chronicled, demanded careful attention, patience, and above all, faith in the extraordinary mind that guided our every step. The morning after our second visit to Camden Row dawned with a peculiar clarity, though the streets of London remained slick with lingering fog and drizzle. The air, sharp with the scent of the Thames and coal smoke, carried the faint murmur of the city waking to another day, yet within Baker Street there was a heavier silence. Holmes was already at his table, surrounded by an array of papers, manuscripts, and a curious assortment of small objects whose purpose I could not immediately discern. "Watson," he began without preamble, "the previous visits have yielded much in the way of observation, yet nothing decisive. The first suspect is a reluctant participant rather than the architect of this mischief. And now we must focus on what has been overlooked, subtle, hidden, and easily disregarded by the ordinary mind." I leaned forward eagerly. "A hidden clue, Holmes?" "In what form?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he produced from the drawers a small envelope, yellowed with age, and with a faint mustiness that bespoke long confinement. The envelope bore no marking save for a single crimson handprint, small and smudged, in the upper corner. "This," Holmes said, placing it upon the table, was delivered anonymously to the yard shortly after the disappearance. The inspector dismissed it as a prank, but observe, the envelope itself contains subtle irregularities: the weight of the paper, the angle of the seal, the faint chemical trace upon its surface. A careful analysis reveals it to be of the same composition as the painted hand discovered at Camden Row. I bent closer, examining it as best I could. Indeed, the paper felt unusually heavy, and the faint odor of camphor lingered. So someone is deliberately leaving us a trail? I asked. Precisely, Holmes replied. But the trail is deliberately misleading, designed to suggest familiarity where none may exist. Observe the fold of the envelope, slightly off-center. The crease is uneven, suggesting it was handled by a person left-handed, yet the handprint itself is clearly that of a right-handed individual. A subtle misdirection, Watson, but one that hints at the meticulous care taken by our perpetrator. He opened the envelope with a series of precise cuts from his penknife, and within lay a single sheet of thick, textured paper. Upon it was drawn a map, so faint as to be nearly imperceptible, detailing the streets surrounding Camden Row, with a single house circled in crimson ink, the residence of one Miss Lydia Harcourt, a name unknown to us both. Curious, I murmured. Miss Harcourt? I have never heard of her. Holmes' eyes gleamed with excitement. Nor have I, Watson, yet this is precisely the sort of clue one must pursue. The painted hand was not a random warning. It is a signpost, guiding the perceptive to a location of importance. And here, within this envelope, lies our first direct lead toward understanding the individual orchestrating these events. It was then that Holmes' expression grew darker, more intense. He rose abruptly and began pacing the room, hands clasped behind his back. Watson, the genius behind this affair, is clever indeed. We are dealing with someone who not only comprehends psychology and deception, but also possesses knowledge of antiquities, symbolic gestures, and most crucially of Mr. Blythe's habits and associations. The map indicates a location we must visit without delay. There may at this very moment be another piece of this puzzle awaiting discovery. By mid-morning we had secured a cab and navigated the fog-bound streets toward the marked house. Unlike Camden Row, the neighborhood here was quieter, more insular, with narrow lanes and closely pressed brick terraces. Holmes' attention was drawn to every detail: the placement of windows, the tilt of doors, even the pattern of soot upon the chimneys. I struggled to follow his rapid deductions, though I noted the familiar spark of exhilaration in his eyes. The house itself was modest, its door painted a deep forest green, with a small brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. Holmes examined it carefully. Notice, Watson, the scratches around the lock. Not fresh, but deliberate, intended to suggest forced entry. And the absence of other markings implies that our individual knows precisely how to manipulate appearances. An expert hand indeed. We were admitted by a maid who, after a cautious glance at Holmes, led us into a sitting room where a young woman awaited. She rose gracefully, her demeanor composed yet wary, and introduced herself as Miss Lydia Harcourt. Her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to measure us even as she spoke. Mr. Holmes, she said, inclining her head, I received a visit from the yard regarding Mr. Blythe, though I confess I am unfamiliar with the particulars. I understand this involves a painted hand. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Indeed, Miss Harcourt, your residence was indicated in a map sent anonymously, and it is possible that you, knowingly or otherwise, hold information of significance to this matter. Pray, tell me of any unusual visitors, parcels, or disturbances you have noted in recent days. She paused, glancing toward a small cabinet by the window. I have had visitors, yes, but nothing I would call alarming. My uncle, is involved in antiquarian studies, much like Mr. Blythe. Occasionally, colleagues arrive to examine manuscripts or artifacts. One such visitor left a small parcel which I kept in this cabinet. I have not opened it. Holmes' eyes gleamed. A parcel, you say? May we examine it? She nodded, and Holmes carefully lifted the small, unassuming package. It was wrapped in brown paper, sealed with a faint impression of a hand detail so subtle that it would have gone unnoticed by any but the most observant. Holmes' fingers traced the edge of the seal with deliberate care. Curious, he murmured. The wax contains traces of the same vermilion and camphor mixture as the painted hand and envelope. Watson, It appears our perpetrator is establishing a chain of breadcrumbs, each one leading to the next, each carefully designed to engage and mislead. He unwrapped the parcel with surgical precision. Inside lay a collection of papers, notes in an unfamiliar script, diagrams of hands and gestures, and, most remarkably, a small folded sheet of vellum containing a single line of writing. The hand that writes is not the hand that strikes. Holmes' eyes gleamed with that cold, calculating fire I had come to recognize. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is precisely what I suspected. The painted hand is both a literal and symbolic clue. The perpetrator wishes to communicate, yet not openly. To provoke thought, yet avoid direct identification. And here, in Miss Harcourt's possession, lies a link to the hidden hand. Our next move must be cautious, deliberate, and rapid. The game is afoot in earnest." As we departed her house, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the wet gleam of London's streets and the distant murmur of the city at work. I could not shake the sense of anticipation and foreboding that accompanied us. The painted hand was no longer merely a warning or a curiosity. It was the key to a sequence of events that had only begun to reveal its intricate design. Holmes, as always, was several steps ahead, silent yet fully aware of the delicate threads he was beginning to unravel. And I, loyal chronicler, resolved to follow him into the shadows, ready to record each revelation, each subtle clue, and every unexpected twist that the painted hand promised to deliver. Little did we know, the day's discoveries were but the prelude to a second, far more alarming incident, one that would test our powers of observation, deduction, and courage, more severely than any case I had yet chronicled. The days following our discovery at Miss Harcourt's residence were fraught with a peculiar sense of anticipation. London, for all its fog and smoke, seemed to hum with an undercurrent of suspense, as if the city itself were aware that some hidden hand had begun to weave a pattern we were only beginning to perceive. I observed Holmes closely, noting the rare occasions when he allowed a moment of leisure, usually brief, usually consumed with the study of obscure manuscripts or chemical experiments. His mind, I suspected, was never idle, even in moments that seemed calm to the casual observer. It was during one such morning, the gas lamps of Baker Street still glowing faintly against the grey dawn, that a sharp rap at our door announced the arrival of an urgent visitor. Mrs. Hudson's expression was one of muted concern as she ushered in a young constable bearing a telegram, its envelope smudged with rain. Holmes took it with a keen glance, noting its texture, the angle of the folds, and the faint scent of coal smoke mingled with camphor detail that, though subtle, did not escape his attention. "From Scotland Yard," he murmured, breaking the seal with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the message quickly, though the rapidity of his reading did not obscure the flicker of intensity that passed across his features. "Watson, it appears the affair of the painted hand has escalated. Another incident has occurred at Camden Row, a break-in, or possibly worse. Inspector Lestrade requests our immediate presence." We hurried from Baker Street, the fog now thick and clinging, turning every street lamp into a dim halo that seemed to guard some secret. The cab rattled through the wet streets, and Holmes remained unusually silent, his mind clearly moving faster than words could express. When we arrived at Camden Row, a small crowd had gathered outside the Blythe residence, their faces obscured by scarves and umbrellas, their murmurs of speculation filling the air. Lestrade met us at the door, his expression tense, the official facade of confidence strained by concern. "Holmes," he said, without preamble, "it's worse than before. Someone has ransacked the study, papers torn, shelves disturbed, and Dan, there is evidence of forced entry this time. I had hoped your presence might clarify matters. We are at a loss." Holmes' eyes swept the scene with characteristic intensity. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly as we entered, "the distinctions between this intrusion and any ordinary burglary. Note the pattern of the debris, scattered yet deliberate. The window has been forced, but with remarkable precision. Someone wished it to appear violent, yet the damage is minimal, calculated to mislead." I followed him into the study. The room bore signs of disorder, though not of haphazard chaos. Books were shifted, manuscripts opened and thumbed, yet only specific items were disturbed. Most notably, the painted hand, previously preserved under glass, had been moved slightly, though the glass remained intact. Holmes' gaze sharpened as he knelt beside it, examining the faint crimson smudge left at the edge. "Watson," he said, voice low, This is no mere act of vandalism. This is a message. The perpetrator wishes to demonstrate capability, to unsettle those who would intervene, while concealing the true motive. The care with which certain manuscripts have been left untouched, and others subtly rearranged, suggests a mind both precise and cunning our perpetrator has no need to destroy, only to intimidate. Lestrade looked uneasy. Holmes, if you say so, but how are we to determine who did this? Crane has been cooperative, and the household has been secure. No one should have been able to gain entry unnoticed. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his coat. Exactly, Lestrade, and therein lies the significance. Observe the window. The scratches on the sill most would see only forced entry, but the faint residue upon the ledge, combined with the pattern of rainwater upon the pane, indicates that the intruder did not enter in haste. They ascended with caution, deliberately leaving a trace small enough to appear accidental. A subtle signature, Watson, one that would be invisible to all but a keen eye. I bent closer to examine the marks and found them barely perceptible, a series of faint streaks along the wood, almost as though left by gloves smeared with something barely perceptible. I felt a chill run through me. The audacity of the act, combined with its precision, suggested a perpetrator not only skilled but also intimately familiar with Mr. Blythe's routines and the layout of his study. Holmes then moved to the overturned manuscripts, his gloved hands lightly tracing the edges of the pages. Note, Watson, he said, the pattern of selection. Only certain texts have been touched, most notably those concerning Eastern symbology and encoded gestures. This is the work of someone who understands both the content of the library and the habits of its late owner. The painted hand, the envelope, the map, they were preparatory. Now, the intruder has acted to advance the next stage of their plan. Lestrade frowned, clearly perplexed. So, Holmes, you believe this is not theft, not ordinary crime, but what exactly? A demonstration, Holmes replied, his eyes flashing with sudden clarity. A calculated move to mislead investigators while sending a message to those attuned enough to interpret it. The painted hand was the opening act, this intrusion the escalation. And mark my words, Watson, there will be a response perhaps sooner than we anticipate. The hand that paints now moves in the shadows. He paused, examining a small smear of crimson upon the rug, faint yet unmistakable. Watson noticed this, a residue of the same vermilion mixture. The intruder has been careful, but not infallible. They wish to signal to be noticed yet remain unidentified. Observe the angle of the smear. The slight overlap with the rug's patternette is deliberate, yet entirely invisible to the casual observer. I could not help but feel a rising sense of apprehension. Holmes' observation suggested a mind capable of orchestrating events across multiple locations, manipulating perception and expectation with a meticulousness I had never before witnessed. London, it seemed, had become the stage for a drama of intelligence and subtlety, with the painted hand as the emblem of a game we were only beginning to grasp. Holmes, having catalogued every detail, turned toward Lestrade. You must cordon the area, maintain vigilance, and report any unusual visitors immediately. And you, Watson, shall accompany me. We must pursue the trail indicated by the previous clue, the map from Miss Harcourt. The next move of this elusive figure will reveal itself there, and I intend to be ready. As we departed Camden Row, the fog had grown heavier, curling around the street lamps and muffling the distant clatter of carts and footsteps. Holmes remained unusually silent during the cab ride, his gaze fixed upon the mist as though he could perceive the movement of some hidden presence. I, seated beside him, felt the weight of anticipation pressing upon me. The painted hand, once a singular curiosity, had evolved into a signal of peril and intellect combined, warning that London's streets now concealed both danger and insight in equal measure. By the time we reached Baker Street, I understood that this case had entered a new phase. The painted hand was no longer merely a puzzle, it was the instrument of a carefully orchestrated escalation. And Holmes, as ever, was poised at the center of it, ready to anticipate moves that the untrained eye could not even imagine. The second incident had occurred, the stakes had risen, and the true architect of the painted hand's mystery remained hidden, yet far from inactive. London, with its fog and gaslight, awaited the next revelation. And I, faithful chronicler, knew that the unfolding drama would demand both observation and courage in equal measure. The morning after the unsettling second incident at Camden Row, London seemed unusually subdued. The persistent fog hung low and stubborn over the streets, muffling the distant clatter of carts and the occasional cry of a street vendor. Even the hansom cabs moved cautiously, their wheels splashing the rain-soaked streets in an oddly muted rhythm. Baker Street, too, bore the tension, and I found the usual bustle subdued as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes, seated in his high-backed chair, was already immersed in a collection of maps, manuscripts, and faintly numbered notes. He had, by now, developed a pattern of rising early, analyzing details with the meticulousness of a scholar and the relentlessness of a hunter. His eyes, bright and piercing, darted from one document to another, pausing on some subtle mark as though the faintest ink blot contained the secrets of the universe. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "we are now entering the stage of misdirection. Observe carefully. The painted hand, the anonymous envelope. The intrusion at Camden Row all are carefully calculated to guide investigators toward false conclusions. Our adversary understands that the human mind is prone to assume patterns that are only apparent, and exploits this propensity with remarkable skill." I leaned closer, pen poised to record, as Holmes gestured to a series of sketches spread across the table. Each depicted the layout of the Blythe study, the position of books, the placement of chairs, and most intriguingly the subtle alterations made to manuscripts and letters. "Observe," he said, pointing to a faint line on one sketch, the positioning of the Fifth Circle manuscript. It was deliberately left slightly askew to suggest casual handling, yet the dust pattern beneath it reveals a prior rearrangement, unnoticed by anyone but the most attentive observer. "This is no accident, Watson. It is a psychological clue. The intruder wishes to suggest activity that did not occur." I nodded, though I found it increasingly difficult to follow the rapid deductions. Holmes, however, seemed entirely in his element, as though the confusion around us only sharpened his mind. Our quiet morning was interrupted by another visitor, a young clerk from a nearby antiquarian bookstore, evidently summoned by Holmes' discreet inquiries the previous day. He entered hastily, eyes bright with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "I believe I have some information regarding the manuscripts of Mr. Blythe. A gentleman came in to purchase volumes on Eastern symbols, and he seemed rather anxious. He mentioned the painted hand, though I did not understand what he meant at the time." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Describe this gentleman precisely. Do not omit a single detail." The clerk hesitated, then continued. "He was of medium height, dark hair, with a manner both courteous and urgent. He wore gloves, and his overcoat was damp from the fog. He seemed unusually familiar with Mr. Blythe's collection, though I did not know him personally. He left quickly, but I recall that he glanced at me as if expecting me to follow." Holmes' lips pressed together. "Watson, this is precisely the sort of misdirection we anticipated. Our adversary is now moving in public spaces, subtly testing reactions, and cultivating traces designed to suggest familiarity and guilt elsewhere. Observe the dual purpose. 1. To assess knowledge among witnesses, and 2. To mislead investigators into attributing motive to the wrong individual." I felt a shiver, both from admiration of Holmes' insight and from the growing tension of the case. The sophistication of our adversary's approach suggested intellect rivaling Holmes' own, yet with a moral ambiguity that allowed for manipulation without overt violence. Holmes rose suddenly, gathering his coat and hat. "We must investigate this gentleman ourselves. His movements, his purchases, and his attention to the manuscripts may illuminate the next layer of this puzzle. And Watson, be prepared. The path ahead is rife with deliberate false leads, each intended to obscure the true motive and identity of our mysterious hand." The streets of London had grown even gloomier as we traversed the mist-shrouded lanes. Every gas lamp haloed with fog, every shadow potentially concealing a watcher. Holmes' eyes darted frequently, noting every passerby, every subtle movement, as though the city itself were revealing its secrets to him alone. We soon arrived at the antiquarian bookstore, a modest shop with tall windows lined with carefully arranged volumes. The clerk, upon recognizing Holmes, gestured for us to follow him to the back room. There, among shelves of manuscripts and rare books, we began a painstaking reconstruction of the gentleman's visit. Holmes moved quickly, his eyes scanning volumes, dust patterns, and marks upon the spines of books. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, the repetition of certain volumes handled in sequence. The gentleman's attention was directed by a pattern only he could understand, likely a mnemonic or symbolic reference. The purpose: to guide attention, yet to leave an impression of randomness to the casual observer. This is the art of misdirection. I bent over a series of smudges upon the polished wooden counter. So these markings, traces of ink and handling, are meant to mislead? Precisely, Holmes replied. They suggest intent, but misdirect the observer from the true focus. The hand behind this affair delights in complexity, Watson, in layers that beguile, challenge, and provoke the mind. Notice the care taken to avoid obvious clues. A casual observer would find nothing. Yet, for those who watch closely, subtle truths emerge. He paused, studying a faint stain upon the ledger. The gentleman's interactions were deliberate. He did not seek knowledge for its own sake, nor for casual curiosity. Observe the order of selection. The slight hesitation before handling specific volumes. This is the mark of someone attempting to emulate Mr. Blythe's behavior while subtly guiding witnesses, and perhaps even law enforcement, along a path of confusion. I could not help but marvel at Holmes' insight, though a shadow of unease fell over me. The painted hand had begun as a singular curiosity, yet now it had evolved into a mechanism for manipulation, psychological, intricate, and disturbing in its precision. Holmes, having examined every available detail, finally straightened. Watson, we must anticipate the next stage. The intruder's objective is now clearer. To provoke, to mislead, to test. Each act is a probing inquiry into the perception, intelligence, and diligence of those observing. And now, we must set our own countermeasures, lest we be drawn into a labyrinth from which we cannot emerge unscathed. As we left the shop and returned to the misted streets, I felt the weight of the case pressing upon me. Misdirection, once subtle, now pervaded every aspect of our investigation. The painted hand was no longer a mere signal or warning, it was a device to manipulate thought, a puzzle in human psychology as much as in fact. Holmes walked beside me, his eyes glinting with that cold, analytical fire I had come to recognize. Watson, he said quietly, the game has now entered a phase where caution must equal intelligence. False leads will abound, and the unprepared mind will be lost in shadows. But we shall proceed, step by step, with patience and observation, and in time, every misdirection will reveal its purpose, every shadow its meaning. I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The city itself seemed to recede into the fog as we made our way back to Baker Street, each gas lamp casting elongated shadows, each alleyway hinting at secrets yet to be uncovered. The hand that had begun as a painted symbol of curiosity had grown into a challenge of intellect and perception, and Holmes, as ever, was prepared to navigate its labyrinth. Yet I could not shake the uneasy notion that we were being watched not merely by witnesses or suspects, but by a mind that delighted in evasion, in manipulation, and in the art of deliberate misdirection. The next move, I knew, would be decisive. The morning after our painstaking observations at the antiquarian bookstore, London was shrouded in a mist so dense that the familiar outlines of Baker Street seemed almost to vanish. The gas lamps, dim and distorted, cast long, wavering shadows across the wet cobblestones. Holmes, as always, was already awake, seated at the table with an array of papers, maps, and small implements, his keen eyes scanning every detail with a deliberation that made even the most minor irregularities seem portentous. "Watson," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "we must take proactive measures. The painted hand has served its initial purpose, to provoke and mislead. The recent intrusion and the activity at the bookstore indicate an escalation. Our adversary is testing our perceptions, gauging our responses, and deliberately sowing confusion. Now it is time to set a countermeasure, an enticement to provoke action, a trap to reveal intent." I leaned forward, curiosity and apprehension in equal measure. "Holmes, you mean to lure the individual out?" "Precisely," he replied. "We cannot afford the passive approach. Our opponent has shown both intelligence and patience. To confront such a mind without preparation is folly. Instead, we must anticipate, manipulate, and observe. A psychological trap, Watson, is far more effective than any physical constraint, and as usual, it will require subtlety and discretion." Holmes began to outline his plan with meticulous detail. First, he intended to craft a correspondence, deliberately left to be discovered by the person behind the painted hand. The letter, bearing certain specific words and phrases, would suggest knowledge that only the true perpetrator could possess. It was designed not to accuse but to provoke a response, to elicit a revealing action. Secondly, Holmes proposed a physical presence at Camden Row under the guise of ordinary investigation. He would station us in a position visible to the observer, yet concealed, allowing him to monitor any movements. This, he explained, would create the impression that the investigation had stalled, encouraging the perpetrator to act boldly, confident in their control of the situation. And Watson, he added with a slight smile, we shall employ an element of misdirection ourselves. The painted hand, after all, is both a message and a ruse. By establishing our own carefully crafted signals, we may guide the adversary into revealing their intentions prematurely. Timing, observation, and patience are all that is required. I noted his meticulous reasoning, though I could not suppress a sense of trepidation. We were about to engage in a form of mental chess, with a mind that had thus far demonstrated equal skill in manipulation and concealment. Every decision, every movement, would require precision, or the consequences could be dire. Holmes prepared the letter with characteristic exactitude. Using heavy parchment and a carefully chosen shade of ink, he penned words that suggested knowledge of the painted hand's origins and a keen awareness of its symbolic meaning. The phrases were subtle, alluding to Eastern symbology and the rare manuscripts Blythe had studied, yet sufficiently ambiguous that only one who truly understood the references would recognize their significance. Once complete, Holmes carefully placed the letter in a small envelope, sealing it with wax pressed into the impression of a hand, a clever mimicry of the original painted hand, but executed in a manner deliberately distinct to those attuned to observation. The envelope was then placed within view in the Blythe study, deliberately left as though overlooked by investigators. We must wait, Watson, Holmes said, his voice calm yet intense. Once the letter is discovered by the true perpetrator, they will act. Our job is to observe without revealing, to allow their actions to betray both intent and identity. We spent the remainder of the day preparing Camden Row. Holmes arranged small observation points within the house, concealed behind heavy curtains and arranged furniture, allowing a clear view of the study and entrance without exposing ourselves. Every possible vantage point was calculated to minimize detection while maximizing observation. By evening, the streets outside had quieted. The usual murmur of vendors and clatter of carts gave way to a muted stillness, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant watchman. Holmes positioned himself behind the curtains, his eyes fixed upon the study, while I remained nearby, recording observations and noting the smallest detail, the faintest movement of curtains, the lightest shadow upon the floor, the subtle glimmer of reflected gaslight. Hours passed with the slow, almost painful deliberation of suspense. The fog outside pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of the street and lending a sense of isolation to the house. Holmes' focus never wavered. His hand, occasionally tapping upon the table, betrayed the intensity of his anticipation. At last, near midnight, a shadow appeared at the edge of the study window. I observed at first a figure, slight, moving with deliberate caution, gloved hands brushing along the window frame as though ensuring minimal trace. Holmes' eyes, however, were already fixed, scanning every detail: the length of the coat, the tilt of the hat, the movement of the feet. There, he whispered. Observe the hesitation. The hand adjusts the envelope ever so slightly. Confidence mingled with caution, the hallmark of one familiar with these manuscripts, yet wary of observation. The figure entered the room, moving with precise, deliberate care. They approached the envelope, examining it as though reading both message and intention. Then, after a pause, they retrieved it, lifting it carefully as though aware of potential traces left behind. Holmes' eyes narrowed, his mind working at a pace I could barely follow. Note, Watson, he murmured, the careful handling, the deliberate attention to our signal. They have recognized it as communication intended for them. Every movement is calculated. Observe the hesitation before opening. They fear error, yet desire revelation. This is the true mind behind the painted hand. I could scarcely contain my astonishment. Every gesture, every adjustment, every pause was fraught with meaning, decipherable only through Holmes' extraordinary perception. And yet, even as the identity of the figure became clearer, the mystery deepened. The painted hand was more than a symbol, it was a psychological instrument, a device for manipulation and observation, and we were now its silent audience. Holmes leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Soon, Watson, all shall be revealed, but for now, patience. The adversary must act, and we must observe. Every decision, every motion, every trace they leave will serve as confirmation of intent and identity. And when they step fully into the open, we shall see the culmination of the painted hand's intricate deception." I recorded his words, my hand trembling slightly, aware that we had entered the most critical stage of the investigation. The painted hand, once a solitary clue, had become a device for testing, provoking and ultimately revealing the intelligence and cunning of its creator. Holmes, as ever, remained 3 steps ahead, and I, faithful chronicler, prepared to capture every detail as the trap he had set began to yield its secrets. As the night deepened, the fog thickened, curling about the windows and muffling the sounds of London. Holmes' eyes never left the study, and I could feel, with a mixture of fear and admiration, the tension of anticipation that gripped us both. The game was now fully underway, and the next moves would determine both the exposure of the culprit and the ultimate resolution of this perplexing case. The night of observation stretched into hours that seemed simultaneously interminable and electric. London's fog had thickened to an almost tangible substance, curling around street lamps, blanketing the cobbles, and cloaking every movement in obscurity. Within the Blythe residence, Holmes and I remained concealed behind the heavy curtains, our attention fixed upon the study, where the painted hand had been left as the centerpiece of our trap. Holmes, motionless but for the occasional pen tap against his notebook, whispered observations in a tone so low I could barely hear. Watson observed the subtle movements. Every hesitation, every shift of weight, every adjustment of the envelope. These are not the gestures of a novice. The adversary is aware of observation, aware of our scrutiny, yet compelled by the signal to act. The painted hand has done its work. I watched, tense and eager, as the shadow at the window our long-sought adversary entered the study. The figure's movements were deliberate and calculated, gloved hands brushing lightly over the desk as if to avoid leaving any trace, yet pausing at the envelope with evident recognition. Holmes' eyes, luminous in the dim lamplight, tracked every detail. "Note, Watson," he murmured, "the tilt of the head, the slight adjustment of the coat, the manner in which the envelope is lifted. This is the signature of intent, unmistakable to one trained to see beyond the obvious. Observe also the hesitation before opening it is a silent question. Does the observer understand the message?" The figure carefully unfolded the envelope and withdrew the letter within, scanning its contents with meticulous attention. I could not discern the expression beneath the hat and shadowed face, but Holmes' reaction betrayed understanding. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed together, and for the first time that night, he allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to cross his features. "Watson," he whispered, "we have the proof we require. Observe the precise sequence of reactions. The hand trembles ever so slightly. The eyes dart toward the window as if confirming our presence. Recognition, yes, but not panic. Confidence mingled with caution. This is the mind behind the painted hand." With extraordinary subtlety, Holmes slipped from our concealment, moving silently across the room as though a shadow had materialized in the dim light. I followed close behind, heart pounding, acutely aware that a single misstep could alert the intruder and spoil the culmination of our painstaking trap. The figure, still absorbed in the letter, did not perceive our approach until Holmes' sharp, deliberate voice rang in the study. And so the game has reached its appointed stage. The intruder finally revealed froze, a hand clutching the envelope, eyes wide with a mixture of recognition and defiance. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I trust you now understand that every gesture, every smudge, every deliberate misplacement of ink and manuscript has been observed and interpreted. The painted hand was never merely a symbol, it was a test, a challenge to intellect, to perception, and ultimately to judgment. And now it has led us to you." For a moment the room was silent save for the distant, muffled sounds of the London streets outside. Then the intruder spoke, voice calm but measured, betraying both awareness and an acknowledgement of defeat. "Holmes," they said, "I anticipated that my designs might be observed. but I did not expect your foresight to extend so precisely. You have, indeed, read every gesture. Holmes inclined his head, expression cold yet controlled. It is not foresight but observation, methodical, meticulous and unwavering. You sought to mislead, to manipulate and to obscure, yet in your very attempts to disguise intent, you revealed it. Every careful placement, every shadow you left, every hesitation in your movements has been catalogued. You have played your game well, but not well enough. I now saw clearly the intruder's features, visage familiar yet previously obscured by shadow. It was one of Mr. Blythe's colleagues, a man of refined appearance, deliberate movements, and unmistakable intelligence. His gloved hands betrayed traces of vermilion ink, faint yet undeniable, a signature of the painted hand. Your knowledge of Mr. Blythe's manuscripts, your understanding of symbology and subtle psychological cues, and your deliberate misdirection were all intended to conceal your ultimate objective. Holmes continued, pacing slowly before the intruder. Yet your efforts, brilliant as they were, contained one unavoidable flaw, the insistence upon signaling, upon leaving a trace to be interpreted. That very insistence has guided us to you. The intruder's composure did not falter. And you believe your observation sufficient to convict me? Holmes' gaze, cold and piercing, met the intruder's. Not belief, but certainty. The painted hand was both lure and key, each stage calculated to reveal understanding, yet conceal motive. And now, every inconsistency, every deliberate misplacement, every shadowed gesture aligns to a single conclusion. You are the orchestrator of these events. The intruder finally lowered the envelope, a gesture of reluctant surrender. Very well, they said. I concede that the intellect before me is superior. Yet I assure you, my purpose was never malevolent. Curiosity, the desire for understanding, and the compulsion to test the boundaries of knowledge guided my actions. The painted hand was intended as experiment, not as threat. Holmes' expression softened slightly, though his tone remained resolute. Intent is often irrelevant to consequence. Your actions have caused confusion, fear, and risk. The law will determine the penalty appropriate to your deeds. But the intellectual exercise, the intricacy, the design, the deliberate misdirection has provided illumination for which I am grateful. Every subtlety, every trace, every moment of hesitation has been noted. I stood silently, awed and relieved, the tension that had gripped us for so many nights beginning to dissipate. Holmes turned to me, eyes reflecting both triumph and the familiar spark of intellectual satisfaction. Watson, he said quietly, observe how a mind of equal cunning can both conceal and reveal. This is the lesson of the painted hand. In every deliberate act of misdirection lies the potential for truth, should one possess the patience and acuity to perceive it. The intruder, now subdued and compliant, allowed us to examine the manuscripts and documents that had guided the plot. The painted hand, once a symbol of mystery and subtle threat, had revealed its purpose, fully an intricate test of perception, intellect and psychological manipulation. Every move, every trace, every adjustment had been deliberate, yet entirely intelligible once viewed through the lens of Holmes' extraordinary deductive reasoning. By the early hours of dawn, London's fog had begun to lift, and the city seemed to exhale a quiet sigh. The case, though complex and layered with misdirection, had reached its decisive moment. The painted hand, enigmatic and artful, had guided us to the truth, and the intruder's identity was no longer a mystery. Holmes, as ever, remained composed, his mind already turning to the finer points of observation, implication, and deduction. I, faithful chronicler, could only record the events with a mixture of awe and admiration, aware that the culmination of this case was a testament not only to his intellect but also to the extraordinary interplay of mind and misdirection that defines the art of investigation itself. As we escorted the intruder into the custody of Inspector Lestrade, Holmes spoke quietly, his gaze distant yet reflective. Watson, the painted hand has served its purpose. It has misled, revealed, and instructed. And in its final revelation, it demonstrates that observation, patience, and intellect remain the supreme tools of justice. I could not help but marvel at the clarity and precision with which Holmes had unraveled the intricate web of deception. The city, with its fog, shadows, and secrets, had yielded its truth to the singular mind capable of discerning what others could not. And I, recorder of these events, felt privileged to have witnessed the final act of a drama as intricate as it was illuminating. The city of London, bathed in the grey light of morning, seemed almost to exhale after the tense days and nights of observation and pursuit. Fog lingered in the alleys and over the Thames, yet there was a subtle clarity now, an easing of the tension that had pressed upon every street and home. Baker Street itself, though still alive with the familiar bustle of hansom cabs and early street vendors, felt quieter, subdued almost as though it too had participated in the long vigil. Holmes and I returned to our rooms after delivering the intruder to Inspector Lestrade. For my part, I felt a profound mixture of relief and admiration. Though I had witnessed countless cases with Holmes, there remained a singular thrill in observing the culmination of a plot so intricately constructed, a puzzle that had demanded every ounce of his acute perception. Holmes, however, remained unusually contemplative. He paced the room slowly, gloved hands clasped behind him, eyes fixed on the floor as if tracing invisible lines of thought. "Watson," he said quietly, breaking the stillness, "there is something almost poetic about the painted hand. It was from the beginning a symbol, a device, and a message. Each act of misdirection, each carefully calculated move, was intended to test, to provoke, to teach. And in that, there is a lesson both intellectual and moral." I settled into my chair, pen poised, eager to capture his reflections. "A lesson, Holmes? In what sense that crime and..." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Not in that sense. The lesson lies in observation, patience, and discernment. The painted hand could have misled us indefinitely had we been careless, inattentive, or impetuous. Yet every subtle trace, every hesitation, every deliberate misplacement of manuscripts was a guidepost. The mind that conceives such a plan is capable of immense skill, but also subject to the very human imperfection of leaving a signature, a trace. That signature has been our salvation." I nodded, reflecting on the events of the past days. The intruder, while highly intelligent, had underestimated the persistence and acuity of Holmes' observation. Every shadow, every smear of vermilion, every hesitation had been catalogued, interpreted, and ultimately used to unravel the truth. It was a demonstration not only of intellect but also of moral responsibility, the knowledge that brilliance, untempered by ethics, could nonetheless yield chaos. Holmes moved to the window, peering out at the street below, fog curling around the lamplight. "Watson, the city is full of hidden gestures, symbols, and intentions. The painted hand, in its subtlety, reminds us that perception is everything. What seems obvious is often a diversion. What seems trivial may conceal the truth, and those who fail to observe carefully are doomed to remain misled." I ventured a question I had long contemplated. "And the intruder, what fate awaits him?" Holmes turned, expression measured yet unflinching. "The law will decide. The intruder's motives were not malicious in the conventional sense, yet his actions endangered and manipulated. Justice must consider both intention and consequence. For our purposes, the case is concluded, yet the intellectual lesson remains a caution and a guide for future endeavors." In the following days, London resumed its ordinary rhythm, though the memory of the painted hand lingered in my mind. I visited Camden Row and Miss Harcourt's residence once more, to ensure the resolution of loose ends and to gather the final details for my account. Miss Harcourt, composed and courteous, expressed relief that the matter had concluded without injury or further escalation. She allowed me to examine the manuscripts and the subtle traces that had served as the key to unraveling the mystery. Holmes, meanwhile, continued his methodical study of the artifacts, noting minor irregularities and subtle patterns that had not initially seemed significant. I observed him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, aware that even now he remained 3 steps ahead of the ordinary world, attuned to details invisible to all but his extraordinary perception. One evening, as we sat in the familiar warmth of our rooms, I ventured a reflection aloud. "Holmes, the painted hand was remarkable not merely for the mystery it created, but for the intelligence it revealed. Do you not find it extraordinary that a single symbol could guide so many actions, provoke so much thought, and yet conceal so much truth?" Holmes, polishing his violin absent-mindedly, nodded. "Indeed, Watson. Symbols have power not merely in what they represent, but in how they influence perception. The painted hand served as both lure and key. It is a reminder that intelligence, in the hands of one who understands human nature, can be both enlightening and perilous, and that is why careful observation and patience are paramount. As the weeks passed, I chronicled the full account of the case, recording each subtle clue, each carefully observed movement, and every instance of misdirection and revelation. The painted hand, once an enigma, now lay clearly within the chain of deduction, a testament to Holmes' extraordinary skill and unwavering attention to the smallest detail. In quiet moments, I reflected upon the moral complexity of the case. The intruder had not been driven by malice alone, yet his actions caused disruption and fear. Holmes' resolution had relied not on confrontation alone, but on understanding, anticipation, and intellect. Justice, in this instance, was administered not merely through law, but through the illumination of truth, exposing both error and excellence alike. As autumn began to settle over London, the fog lifting to reveal the golden hues of leaves along the streets, Holmes remained his usual enigmatic self. His mind, ever restless, had moved to other inquiries, though the lessons of the painted hand lingered, both for him and for those of us fortunate enough to witness his method. I too felt changed not merely by the intellectual rigor of the case, but by the subtle reminder that observation, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature are as vital in the pursuit of justice as any tangible evidence. The painted hand, once a mere curiosity, had become a symbol of intellect, restraint, and moral insight. Holmes, settling into his chair with the soft creak of leather, glanced toward me with a faint smile. "Watson, the case is concluded. Yet every resolved mystery leaves echoes, lessons for those who would observe carefully. Remember this, the world is rarely as it seems. Shadows conceal much, yet perception reveals all, if one is prepared to notice." I could do nothing but nod, pen in hand, recording his words and the final reflections on the case that had tested both intellect and intuition. The painted hand, enigmatic in its inception, had revealed its ultimate purpose, a testament to observation, deduction, and the extraordinary interplay of mind and circumstance that defines the art of investigation itself. Thus concluded the case of the painted hand, a tale of subtle manipulation, intellectual challenge, and moral reflection, an episode that demonstrated the depths of human cunning and the extraordinary skill required to illuminate truth where shadows abound. And as always in the quiet streets of London, the fog lifted, leaving clarity, observation, and understanding in its wake. The days following the resolution of the painted hand affair were remarkably quiet on Baker Street, yet there was a peculiar tension that lingered, like a shadow of thought refusing to dissipate. Holmes, as ever, maintained his routine with unwavering discipline, yet I observed subtle differences in his demeanor. A certain contemplative distance, a quiet focus upon matters that remained unseen, unspoken, and perhaps only fully perceptible to his extraordinary intellect. I, meanwhile, busied myself with the meticulous documentation of our experiences. Every observation, every sequence of misdirection, and every subtle trace left by the intruder had been recorded. The city of London, in all its fog and muted bustle, remained oblivious to the intellectual duel that had unfolded within its streets and chambers. Yet I felt with an acute awareness that the lessons of this case extended far beyond the resolution of mere mischief or curiosity. Holmes, seated by the window with his violin resting across his knees, spoke softly without turning. "Watson, the painted hand was a study in deliberate misdirection and psychological subtlety. Observe how intellect, when combined with an incomplete moral compass, can orchestrate confusion as effectively as the most overt crime. Yet it is precisely within these subtleties that understanding, perception, and foresight demonstrate their worth." I nodded, pen poised, sensing the weight of his reflections. "Holmes, do you believe the intruder understood the consequences of his actions? Or was this purely an intellectual exercise?" Holmes' eyes met mine, clear and unwavering. "Intent is rarely pure, Watson. The man sought knowledge, understanding, and perhaps to test boundaries. Yet intellect divorced from empathy or ethical consideration often yields consequences unforeseen. Observation alone cannot prevent risk, but it can illuminate potential paths, consequences, and decisions. That is why the careful cataloguing of behavior, every hesitation, every misplacement, every deliberate shadow is paramount." He returned to his violin, drawing a soft, almost meditative note that lingered in the quiet room. "Consider, too, the subtle interplay of human psychology. The intruder relied upon confidence, misdirection, and the assumption that others would overlook the smallest traces. Yet even the most cunning mind leaves a signature, and in that signature, every error, hesitation and choice is revealed to one trained to observe. I reflected upon the depth of his insight. The painted hand, though outwardly a simple emblem, had been a tool, a test, and ultimately a key to understanding human behavior. The lessons it offered were manifold: vigilance, patience, acuity of observation, and the humility to recognize the limitations of perception. "Watson," Holmes continued, his tone now tinged with an unusual softness, "it is tempting to believe that intellect alone can solve all puzzles. Yet the painted hand reminds us that context, perception, and moral consideration are equally critical. A brilliant mind may manipulate with elegance, yet in that manipulation lies evidence, subtle as it may be, of intent, capability, and human fallibility." I could not help but muse aloud. So the case teaches us both about crime and about the mind, how understanding patterns, symbols, and behavior reveals far more than the obvious facts. "Exactly," Holmes said, his fingers resting lightly upon the strings of the violin. "The world is filled with signals, Watson, most of them subtle, most of them unobserved. To see them requires patience, attentiveness, and the willingness to look beyond appearances. And to interpret them correctly requires both logic and an appreciation of human nature in all its complexity." We spoke little for the remainder of the morning, the room filled with the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional clatter of a passing cab. I observed Holmes as he moved quietly among his books, his gaze resting upon titles that seemed mundane yet, to him, contained layers of knowledge awaiting precise application. Later that afternoon, I ventured outside for a brief walk, seeking the familiar comfort of London's foggy streets. I noted the contrast between the city's ordinary bustle and the extraordinary intricacy of the events we had witnessed. The painted hand had been more than a clue, it had been a revelation of intellect, subtlety, and consequence. Every citizen passing along the Thames or beneath the gas lamps remained oblivious, yet to us the lesson resonated with a clarity that felt almost tangible. Upon returning, I found Holmes seated by the fireplace, pipe in hand, lost in thought. "Watson," he said, as I entered, "cases such as the painted hand are reminders that intellect is not merely a tool of detection, but a lens through which the world may be understood. Observation, deduction, and subtle moral awareness are the instruments of discernment. And yet, even with all these, patience is required above all. Time reveals truth where the eye alone cannot." I could not help but admire the profound calm with which he spoke. Though the affair had been complex, layered with misdirection and deliberate obfuscation, Holmes had unraveled it with the quiet precision of a master. The painted hand, once mysterious and alarming, now stood as a testament to the power of intellect guided by careful observation and ethical awareness. "Holmes," I said softly, "do you ever wonder how many such games are being played unseen, beyond our knowledge, in the streets of London?" Holmes' gaze, sharp and unwavering, met mine. "More than we shall ever know, Watson. Yet our duty is to observe where we may, to interpret where possible, and to act with both intellect and judgment. The painted hand has taught us that the world is seldom simple, that motives are complex, and that even the subtlest gestures contain meaning. And above all, that patience, perception, and reason will illuminate truth where chaos seeks to obscure it." I recorded his words carefully, aware that these reflections, like the case itself, were rich with both instruction and insight. The painted hand had challenged intellect, revealed subtlety, and tested our understanding of human behavior. And in its wake it left not merely a resolved mystery, but a profound meditation on observation, morality, and the art of discernment itself. As evening fell over Baker Street, the gas lamps casting long shadows upon the walls, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of repose. He glanced toward me with that faint, inscrutable smile, as though acknowledging both the conclusion of this intricate affair and the lessons it had imparted. I, faithful chronicler, could only marvel at the depth, subtlety, and ultimate resolution of the case, aware that the painted hand, though now fully revealed, had left an indelible impression on both mind and spirit. Thus ended the period of reflection following the affair of the painted hand, a time to consider subtle lessons, the importance of perception, and the intricate balance of intellect and morality that defines the work of Sherlock Holmes. And as the fog settled quietly over London, I felt a sense of completion, tempered with the recognition that the city would always hold mysteries, and that Holmes' insight would remain the guiding light in the shadows of human complexity. The weeks following the resolution of the painted hand case passed with a curious tranquility that seemed almost unnatural, given the intellectual turbulence we had endured. London resumed its ordinary rhythm, the fog rolling along the Thames, hansom cabs rattling across cobblestones, and the occasional street cry of vendors punctuating the distant clamour. Yet within Baker Street there was a quiet satisfaction, a sense of closure tempered by reflection, and the subtle awareness that the city's mysteries are rarely fully exhausted. Holmes occupied his habitual chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the undulating fog and the dimly glowing gas lamps outside. His violin rested upon his knees, untouched yet ever present, a companion to his thoughts. He seemed unusually pensive, a rare stillness in a mind accustomed to relentless activity. I, meanwhile, busied myself with the meticulous chronicling of the painted hand affair, aware that our account must capture not only the events but the subtlety of intellect, misdirection, and moral reflection that defined the case. "Watson," Holmes said at length, breaking the silence, "the painted hand has left us with lessons that transcend the particulars of the case. It was at once symbol, instrument, and mirror. It revealed the mind of the adversary, yet also reflected the patterns of human perception, the susceptibility to misdirection, and the need for patient, careful observation." I leaned forward, eager to record his reflections. "Indeed, Holmes. And yet it seemed to me that the intruder was not entirely malicious, merely curious, perhaps overreaching in intellect." Holmes inclined his head slightly, expression thoughtful. "Curiosity, untempered by ethical judgment, is sufficient to cause disorder. The intruder's intent may not have been criminal in the conventional sense, yet the consequences were real, and the risks substantial. Intelligence without consideration of effect is as dangerous as malice without motive. That is the subtlety of this affair. It is not merely a matter of action, but of the intricate interplay between cognition, psychology, and consequence." I reflected upon his words. The painted hand, once a mere symbol, had become a profound instrument of revelation, not only uncovering the identity of the intruder, but illuminating the manner in which the mind interprets, assumes, and is occasionally deceived by appearances. It was a testament to Holmes' unparalleled skill that he had deciphered every trace, every hesitation, every subtle misplacement of manuscript and ink. Holmes' gaze drifted toward the street below, eyes focused on some distant, imperceptible detail. "Observe, Watson, that the world is replete with shadows, both literal and figurative. The painted hand represents more than a clue, it is a challenge to perception itself. One may see, yet not observe. One may hear, yet not understand. To detect truth requires more than intellect, it demands patience, attentiveness, and the capacity to discern the subtle signals concealed within ordinary gestures." I could not help but remark on the philosophical gravity of his observations. "And yet, Holmes, there is a sense of satisfaction in this resolution, a clarity that comes from observing the end of a complex design." Holmes allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Satisfaction is a fleeting luxury, Watson, though it is nonetheless deserved when diligence, insight, and ethical judgment converge to illuminate truth. The painted hand, for all its complexity and artifice, has demonstrated that clarity emerges not from chaos alone, but from careful, patient interpretation of the smallest signs. This is the essence of detection and of understanding human nature." The afternoon light waned, casting long shadows across the room, and the fog outside deepened once more. I felt a quiet awe at the enormity of Holmes' intellect, and the precision with which he had orchestrated the unraveling of this intricate puzzle. Every moment, every gesture, every trace of the intruder's presence had been anticipated, observed, and interpreted with extraordinary acumen. Holmes rose and moved to the mantel, adjusting the small collection of chemical vials and instruments arrayed there. "And yet, Watson, there is always more to learn. Every case, no matter how resolved, leaves echoes lessons about perception, morality, and the subtleties of human behavior. The painted hand is concluded, yet its lessons endure, a reminder that observation, deduction, and ethical awareness are perpetual companions to the detective's craft." I set down my pen, reflecting on the depth of the experience. The painted hand, initially mysterious and alarming, had become an instrument of revelation, teaching patience, attentiveness, and the profound impact of subtlety. Holmes, as ever, remained 3 steps ahead, his perception unerring, his moral compass steady, and his intellect unmatched. As evening deepened, casting the room in a muted amber glow, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of repose. He settled into his chair, pipe in hand, eyes closing briefly as though reflecting on the entirety of the case. "Watson," he said softly, "we have observed, interpreted, and recorded. Justice has been served, intellect tested, and the complexities of human behavior illuminated. The painted hand has fulfilled its purpose, and we, as observers, may now rest." I felt a sense of closure, not merely in the resolution of the mystery, but in the philosophical reflection it provided. London, shrouded in fog yet glimmering with the quiet light of gas lamps, seemed to hold 1,000 unseen mysteries, each awaiting the patient eye, the careful mind, and the disciplined intellect that Holmes so perfectly embodied. "Holmes," I said finally, "there will always be another painted hand, another shadow, another test of perception. And yet, with your guidance, we may confront each with clarity and insight." He opened his eyes, a faint gleam of approval in his gaze. "Indeed, Watson, and that is the constant challenge and the unending privilege of our vocation. To observe where others see only shadows, to discern truth where others perceive only confusion, and to act with both intellect and ethical judgment is the essence of detection. That is the final reflection the painted hand leaves with us." And so the case of the painted hand drew to its final conclusion. The intruder's motives had been revealed, the misdirection unraveled, and London's fog had lifted slightly, as if in acknowledgement of clarity restored. Yet, beyond the particulars of the case, a deeper lesson lingered, one of intellect, observation, and morality intertwined, reminding all who pursue truth that the smallest details often conceal the most profound revelations. As I recorded the last notes of the affair, Holmes returned to his violin, drawing a soft, contemplative melody. The sound seemed to fill the room with both calm and quiet triumph, a fitting accompaniment to the resolution of the intricate puzzle we had navigated together. The painted hand, enigmatic and artful, had been unmasked, the mystery resolved. And as the final shadows of evening stretched across Baker Street, I reflected that the true marvel of our work lay not merely in the revelation of criminals, but in the illumination of human nature itself, a perpetual lesson, inscribed in both action and reflection, and a testament to the unparalleled intellect of Sherlock Holmes.